everybody, I'm Jesse Weber, and welcome back to Law and Crime, where we cover some of the most interesting live trials in the country today. And I'm so happy you're joining us because we are going to be continuing one of the biggest trials in the country right now. It is the Shawn Grate case out of Ohio. As you know, we've been covering that every day. We covered it every day, and Friday was a very interesting day in this case. Now, again, this is about Shawn Grate, this accused serial killer. He faces a 23-count indictment, everything from burglary to kidnapping to rape to murder. It's a really horrific situation, and this man, primarily the three main charges here are in connection with the death of two women, Elizabeth Griffin and Stacy Hicks, as well as the abduction and rape of a third woman. And what we saw Friday, what we heard Friday, I should say, were the confession tapes, the tapes that he was recorded when he did his police interviews, and he confessed to many of the crimes. It was unbelievable to hear, and we're going to talk about that more in a minute. Now, again, what I should tell you about this case is we're going to keep a very careful eye on the courtroom. I'm waiting for it to go live, but we expect the first phase of this case, again, the guilt or innocent phase, to conclude by the end of the week. It will be interesting to see what more the state will do, but even more interesting, what will the defense do? Because up until this point, they haven't done that much. We'll talk more about that case in a minute. Now, I want to preview another case for you that we're covering, a brand new case we're covering here on Law and Crime. It's a case out of Tennessee. It's the case of William Riley Gall, a former Maryville College football player who allegedly stalked and killed his 16-year-old ex-girlfriend, Emma Walker, and she was a high school cheerleader, and this all happened back in November of 2016. It's alleged that Gall fired 2 shots through Walker's bedroom wall while she slept, which ultimately killed her. Now, the details of this case are strange and also tragic, so what we have is a short report explaining more about this case. We believe jury selection is continuing today, and maybe we'll have opening statements by later today, but probably tomorrow. Here's a short report about that case. Take a look.
The man accused in the shooting death of a Knoxville, Tennessee teen is set to begin this week. William Riley Gall, a former Maryville College football player, allegedly stalked and killed 16-year-old Emma Walker, a high school cheerleader, in November 2016. Investigators say Gall and Walker were involved in an ongoing turbulent relationship and allege Gall fired 2 shots through Walker's bedroom wall while she slept, killing the teen. Gall was arrested in connection with the killing after he tried to recruit a friend to help him discard of the murder weapon, but that friend went to authorities, according to police. Gall is charged with 7 counts, including first-degree murder and felony murder.
A lot at stake here in this case, so let's talk a little bit more about it as we wait for the live feed in the Shawn Grate case. And joining me is the person who just gave that report, Law and Crime Editor-in-Chief Rachel Stockman. Rachel, good to see you.
Good morning to you, Jesse.
So what should we make of this case? What do you expect from it?
See, I was just talking to you while we were listening to that report, and I'm really curious as to what Gall's defense is going to be. And I'm sure we're going to hear that during opening statements, because so far, there's quite a few things linking him to this. You have the alleged murder weapon. You have reports that they had a tumultuous relationship between him and the victim here. However, I think you're going to see probably that there was no eyewitness account of him actually doing the shooting that night. Also, he may say, you know, he didn't intend to kill her. He was just trying to scare her by shooting into that bedroom window. We've seen that before. So I'm just trying to, in my mind, go through the possible scenarios of where the defense might be coming with this case, because I think it's certainly going to be interesting. In a case like this, of course, you know, it's going to trial, which means, you know, there's a possibility here he thinks he has a pretty strong defense, at least for the murder 1 charge, and trying to get out of that. Also, something very interesting in this case, felony murder charge. It's a similar case to this Tex MacGyver, where we see prosecutors tacking on this felony murder charge to, I think, is aggravated child abuse,
right.
Which in my mind is a bit of a stretch. That's not typically where you see a felony murder charge tacked on. So another interesting tactic by the prosecution.
So that means that in the course of this child abuse, this felony, she died, and he would be charged with felony murder. Is that the way I'm understanding it?
Yeah, it's one of those where if he's convicted of this child's abuse, then this felony murder is automatically tacked on. And as we've seen in the Tex MacGyver trial that we just covered, that's exactly what happened. It wasn't child abuse, it was aggravated assault, where they found him guilty of that. Therefore, he was then found guilty of felony murder. I think it's going to be a bit of a reach on that charge. Just because, I mean, this isn't really, in my mind, a case of child abuse. I know.
Well, he's older than her, right?
Right, and
so.
they're saying she was under, I think, I'm looking up how old she was, but I think she was obviously under 18. She was still at high school at the time, so that's where
she was 16, yeah.
She was 16, so that's where they're getting this. I think that part of it is a stretch. I'll be interested to see how they directly tie the intentional murder to this, and whether his defense does take the route of trying to say, oh, I was just shooting into her window to scare her.
Yeah.
Or that he wasn't even there, okay? Or are they going to say he wasn't even the one that pulled the trigger?
Well, it'll be interesting to see. It'll be interesting to see which way they go this, because as you made a great point, they are taking this to trial, and they didn't take a plea deal here, so something's up. We don't know. We don't know.
Or the prosecution didn't want to offer anything. They didn't want to lower that charge. They thought this was an intentional murder, and they wanted to go for it, and they weren't willing to come down. That's my guess.
We'll have to see what they ultimately do. I want to get another perspective on this case. Joining me via Skype right now is forensic death investigator from Jacksonville State University, Joseph Scott Morka. Joseph, good morning. How are you?
Hey, good morning, my friend. How are you doing this morning?
Good, Jesse? Good to see you. So during the break, we just talked, you said you had some comments about this case. What is your perspective on it?
Well, listening to the comments that Rachel was making relative to this case, it's interesting. Almost, with the child abuse element to this, it almost seems like a reach, maybe an overcharge. Of course, a lot of us thought that, in the Tex MacGyver case as well, but in recent memory. But I think that it's key here that he didn't just randomly fire into a structure in which she was in. He went to a specific location in which she dwelt, her bedroom. Now, yeah, I guess they could say that he was attempting to scare her, and I think that that's probably the route that they're going to go down. But the connectivity here, putting that weapon in his hand, recovering the projectiles from the scene and from her remains, and matching them up to this weapon. If they can put that weapon in his hand, this is going to be key. Also, I think here we've got this friend that he reached out to initially. I think that that's going to be very compelling testimony in this particular case. So, yeah, I think that they probably got a little bit more here.
Look at this analysis. Look at this analysis from both Rachel and Joseph before the trial even started. Who knows what we'll get when we actually do start it. Again, we expect openings either later today, but probably most likely tomorrow. So it's going to be one to watch. Rachel, you wanted a quick comment on this case?
Well, our own Kathy Russin, who is our senior trial producer, will actually be in Knoxville, Tennessee, covering this trial. So I'm sure we'll have very up-to-date information about this, and hopefully kind of get a heads up on who is being called to the witness stand, including that friend of Gall that you spoke about, that I think will be a critical witness. Also, the grandfather, I assume he's going to take the stand. Of course, you'll remember, if you know this case at all, Gall, the suspect here, borrowed the grandfather's car, and at one point the grandfather realized his pistol, which was in the car, had disappeared, and he reported that missing. So that all is going to be very integral to this case as well.
And it becomes another conversation about, I hate to say it, another shooting about young people getting guns, and what that becomes a larger conversation, but that's a different issue for a different day. Now, that is not the only case that we're covering here on Law and Crime, so I want to switch gears right now, and I hope you're ready, because we have a live feed in the Shawn Grate case out of Ohio. I'm taking a very careful look at it. Shawn Grate is standing up. The jury is coming in. We want to talk a little bit about what we can expect. Now, Rachel, again, we believe this week will be the conclusion of this first phase, this guilt or innocence phase. What do you expect the defense to do?
Well, the defense hasn't done a whole lot during this case. They did not give opening statements. They've done some questioning of the witnesses. We saw some tough cross-examination during the victim's testimony. But overall, I don't really think they've presented much of a defense here. And the bottom line is, I mean, this is a very tough case for them to defend, because you literally, and we saw the tapes on Friday, you have the guy confessing to police.
I know.
I mean,
you can't argue against that. That's really hard.
You have DNA evidence. You have victim testimony. It's a tough case.
Rachel, let's talk about that. I'm here with Joseph Scott Morgan. Joseph, real quick, I know they're going to be starting. What do you make of the crime scene, and in terms of what investigators found there? Because it was a house of horrors.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that's really compelling to me, Jesse, is that he made a statement in one of these confessions where he was caring for them. And this indicates a kind of a progression in his behavior. We think about these other bodies that he's not on trial for, and they were left kind of randomly out there. In this particular case, though, he's got these women where he has access to their remains in the home at any point in time, and he can, in fact, take care of them. I think this is going to go to a bigger issue.
Wait, Joseph, I'm sorry to cut you off. I have to ask you about this point. You mentioned take care of them. These three victims, it seemed like he wanted to be that older brother or that caretaker. Did he pick these victims because they were, in lack of a better word, that he could take care of them? Why these three victims? And I know the next witness is about to come on the stand, so you have about 10 seconds. We'll jump right back into it.
Yeah, I think that is potentially the case. We look at a lot of serial killers who, in fact, want to have these kind of inanimate objects that they can hang around with and take care of, if you will.
All right, Joseph, we have so much to talk about. Stand by, Rachel. We're going live into the courtroom right now. The next witness is on the stand. This is the Shawn Grate case out of Ohio. Okay, so Detective Kim Major is on the stand right now as they sort through some of the documents. I want to go back to Joseph Scott Morgan real quick. We were talking about the crime scene, and one of the things you said was I want to make sure I get this correct, the connectivity between the different victims. What did you make of that?
Well, I think that it goes more to mode relative to how their lives were taken, as well as access to the bodies. This is something that you see that's kind of a thread that runs through some of these serial perpetrators. And, you know, the idea that he had kind of changed in his methodology in which he was ending their lives.
What do you mean by that?
Well, there's one report that the coroner had discovered that it appeared that one of the individuals had died as a result of manual strangulation. And then it kind of, the next case, it kind of changes where it looks as though that he had used an instrument in order to facilitate their death. So we've got a kind of an evolution of what's going on. Either way, these cases are up close and personal. It's not like he's bludgeoning them to death. Even he's in their face actually with his hands or with a ligature. He's not shooting them or stabbing them or anything like that. And then he keeps them around to maintain them at this point, as opposed to in the past. With these cases, I remind you that he's connected to or says he's connected to that he's not on trial for, but these are discarded off in another location. These last two victims are there in the home, and let's not forget this poor woman who escaped. And, you know, at one point in time, I think he even alludes to the point that, well, he wasn't going to harm her. He was just going to keep her around. And that goes to a bigger, kind of a bigger arc relative to this gentleman.
And that was really a big issue for me, too. Why were the bodies kept in the house? It's really a
I mean, does
detail.
that go to his mental awareness as well? In other words, could it go towards, if the defense tries to put forward some kind of insanity defense, the fact that here he was leaving these bodies in his home? I mean, you know, even if he was trying to keep them so the authorities wouldn't find them, to leave decomposing bodies with maggots in your home, I mean, that's just horrible, and,
well,
you know,
you
might
Rachel,
give some insight into his mind.
Yeah, and again, I'm no forensic psychologist. However, I've worked a number of serial cases, and if we could just reflect back to even as far back as Dahmer, you know, we talk about this idea of actus reus and mentis rea. You know, Dahmer was not found absent of his mental faculties. He kept those guys around where he wanted to create these zombies, if you will. You remember the idea that he was, you know, manipulating their brains and injecting them with things and all that. He wanted to keep these people around as company, if you will. He's got higher functioning here. He's thinking about this sort of thing. Dahmer, in that case, I'm wondering if this guy is on some kind of you know, arc relative to his thought pattern, the way he's evolving. You know, they just happen to catch this guy at this point, and it's not like he's a spring chicken. He's 40 years old, so I'd like to know how far back in time this goes, how long, because all of these people, not all, but many of them, do take an arc where they're kind of developing along the way, where they're kind of learning, as grotesque as it is, this kind of avocation that they have for going out and killing people. There is a learning curve. Everything from being sequestered, having privacy to do it, to the methodology that they employ, to being able to discard the body, hide it away, secret it away, and then if they want to go back in cases like, for instance, BTK, that would go back out and dig up bodies and refamiliarize themselves with them, to Dahmer, who kept skulls and trophies around and all those sorts of things. It's a bizarre dynamic that, when you're out on these kind of cases like this, you sit back and the term I like to use with my students at JSU is this idea you're constantly having to observe the abnormal in the context of the normal. You go into somebody's house and there's a body in a closet or down in the basement, and you're thinking, my God, they're using these things for entertainment. So it's quite striking.
It's hard to get into the minds of some of these people and try to understand that. And Rachel, I want to ask you a question. Speaking about the mind of Shawn Grate, and again, that's a live feed you see right there into the courtroom.
And Jesse, it sounds like that they may be playing some kind of another police interview tape, because I just saw them pan towards the computer like they were getting ready to play. I think that detective who's on the stand also interviewed Shawn Grate as well.
Yeah, the detective Kim Major, she also interviewed the defendant, and remember, he made a lot of confessions in that tape, and we'll jump right back into it in a minute. But Rachel, real quick, the idea of understanding Shawn Grate's mind is an issue that we're going to get into. Actually, I'm getting word that we do have the audio now back in there, and I think we want to listen to the confession tape. But Rachel and I are going to talk a little bit more, and Joseph and I, about what's going on in the mind of Shawn Grate and how we can test for that. Let's go back live into the courtroom. Okay, so a lot to take in from what you're watching right now and what you're listening to. One of the most disturbing details about this is that Mr. Grate allegedly made this diary detailing the dates that he committed these killings. I first want to ask from a perspective of trying to get into the mind of what's happening here. I want to speak again to Joseph Scott Morgan, forensic death investigator from Jacksonville State University. From your perspective, what do you make of this diary, for lack of a better word?
It's a compelling piece of evidence, Jesse, because in his own hand, it's confirmatory, not just him verbally, what he had stated in the confession, but also going back, and it's solid information that's a tie back, specifically with the dates. And this goes to maybe, his idea of documentation, solidifying his ability to do these things that he's setting out to do. And this kind of odd tie back also relative to the religious perspective of this, where he's reading a devotional, which has got a whole nother level of interest to it.
And I thought it was particularly compelling, too, during the taped interview where, we finally get some emotion from Shawn Grate when he's talking about his teenage son, and he says, and it's just so chilling, that he hopes that it's not in his son's genes to be a killer, which leads me to think this guy just can't help himself.
That's a good point. Again, I'm here with Rachel Stockman, Law&Crime editor-in-chief. No worries. Rachel, that's an interesting point. Do you think that goes later on to mitigation in the sense, look, he's got a son, he's a human being, he cares about his son, this is a way that maybe if later on, if he's convicted, he shouldn't get the ultimate punishment?
I don't know. They tried that in this other case, Donald Smith. They brought his son to testify during the sentencing, and listen, everyone feels for a child of someone like this, but at the end of the day, it's about the victims, right? And I don't know if that's going to be much of a mitigating factor. However, I did find it very interesting, the fact that he did tear up when talking about his son.
Yeah. Okay, I think we have the audio back. I think we're about listening to more of Grate's conversation with investigators, so let's listen in live. All right, welcome back, everybody. So we are covering right now the Shawn Grate case. That's a live feed. We're listening to his audio confession. We're listening to it. And we're not just listening to it. The jury is listening to that. And that is such a key point. Again, joining me via Skype is Joseph Scott Morgan, forensic death investigator from Jacksonville State University. Joseph, the sexual nature of, if you talk about, we saw this woman, well, we didn't see her, we heard her, the surviving victim, Jane Doe, go on the stand last week. the sexual nature of this, kidnapping a woman and doing whatever you want to her, what does that tell you about, again, I should say this is what the defendant is alleged to have done, but what does that tell you about the perpetrator of this crime?
For one, he wants to have total and complete control over
That's what it
victim.
is? It's about control?
I think that it is. Yeah, control has a lot of different little levers with it when it comes to these people. You've got power issues where you actually have the ability to control the level of pain and discomfort that the individual has, or to their level of comfort where somebody can actually take care of them. And also this idea of what kind of you have the ability in your hands in that moment in time as to whether or not you're going to decide if they're going to live or die, and they can hold this. And in criminal typologies, a lot of people that practice in that area, they refer to this as an asymmetrical relationship where you have a dominant individual who can wield power over this submissive person like this to a great degree. And it seems to me that this guy has he's showing remorse. You were mentioning about his son and everything, but he also has a plan, and that goes to a higher pattern of thought, I think. So I don't know how that's going to play out in the end, if he can be held responsible for these, but it would seem that he has his faculties about him, at least.
So we talk about what's going on in the mind of this defendant, and I want to touch upon one key aspect. Again, I'm here with Rachel Stockman. Rachel, Dr. John Fabian is someone that we keep hearing about when you research this case, and it appears that this is somebody the defense wants to call to do extra testing on the brain of Mr. Grate to try to understand what he suffers from, some sort of mental disease or defect. What do you think about that?
Well, that's why I thought that during the break earlier, when we were talking about how he said during the police interview, and he started tearing up, and he said, I hope that my son doesn't have it in his genes to be a killer like me, or something to that effect.
Right.
I thought that was a very, very chilling thing for him to say. And it also reveals, at least he believed, right, Jesse,
Yeah,
that he couldn't help what he was doing, that it was some kind of need he had to do, some kind of gene. I don't know if I buy it.
Well, that's the question.
I don't know if I buy it, but
Dr. John Fabian says that, you know what, he suffers from a whole plethora of different kinds of disorders, but which ones matter to this and which ones don't? I'm telling you, I read about this. It says that he has a cannabis addiction. Good for him. That doesn't really excuse the behavior, right? You have to really look at this and says, well, what under the law would prevent him from conforming his actions to being a normal person who didn't do this? So it's easy to say there's something wrong with him, but that's an extra kind of degree, right? So for our viewers out there.
Really the threshold is knowing the difference at the time between right and wrong, right? Did he know what he was doing was wrong? And I think so far the testimony we've seen, even the police interview, even though he says maybe he'll say he can't help it, right? He knew pretty damn well that what he was doing was wrong.
Yeah, that's the key right there, ladies and gentlemen. So you're watching a live feed into the courtroom. They're playing back some of the audio. It's a little tough to hear. We're going to try and see if it's going to clear up in a little bit. What I want to do right now, in case anybody missed it, when we had Detective Kim Major on the stand earlier, she talked about this reader. It's kind of like a diary. It is what Mr. Grate allegedly wrote down in this about the dates of the killing. So think about this for a second. You have a defendant. He's on trial for numerous crimes, including the murder of 2 women and the rape and kidnapping and rape of a 3rd, and documenting it in a reader. That's some pretty incredible evidence. Let's play you some of that testimony from earlier today. That's Detective Kim Major. She testified earlier today. That was some of the testimony from earlier, talking about this reader of Shawn Grate's, detailing some of the key dates about when he allegedly murdered these victims. I want to bring in back Joseph Scott Morgan, because, Joseph, we talked during the break trying to understand a timeline here, and one of the ways you talked about a timeline was something you want to see from the coroner. What are you hoping to see from the medical examiner when they testify?
Yeah, well, one of the functions of the coroner and the medical examiner at the scene is to measure the level of postmortem changes, and this can also be examined at the morgue as well. But in the context of the environment in which the body is found, it's going to be very, very important. I'm going to be markedly interested to hear what the death scene investigator has to say about these changes, and these are going to range from everything from postmortem lividity, that's the pooling of blood, to rigor mortis, to even things like body temperature, and also level of decomposition. I think in these cases, because we're kind of far out in time, decomposition and the level of decomposition is going to be key here, and that's going to be the study of how much the body has decayed, how much it's been impacted, say by instance, for instance, relative to larval development in flies, this sort of thing. And again, Jesse, this goes to a bigger picture, doesn't it? This idea that in the court, they're trying to paint this picture. And we've got a lot of clarity right now with the book coming in, or the devotional coming in, where he's made notes, this confession. And then if they can tie this back with what I like to refer to as a biological time frame or timeline, this is going to be markedly impactful, particularly if the coroner can convey this to the jury in layman's terms, to have them understand, listen, from soup to nuts, this is how a body changes. And if prosecution can state, see, he's telling us in scientific terms how the body has decomposed, we refer back to this other evidence that's been previously submitted, it kind of marries up and you kind of tie these things together.
But you wonder, you know, at the end of the day, even though we are meticulously going through all of this information, how much kind of the more technical stuff is going to matter to the jurors in a case like this? Because, you know, if it was a case where he hadn't confessed, where they hadn't found the DNA, where you didn't have the victim testifying to the fact, or the alleged victim, I guess we should say, what she went through, the rape and all these awful things she did, you just wonder, Jesse, how much, you know, kind of the more I guess I'd call them forensic or technical details of this case will matter to the jurors.
Well, let me ask you about that. That's an important point. We have this shot of Mr. Grate side by side with his attorneys, and I wonder what's going through their mind and what they're thinking. And I've been carefully monitoring what kind of questions do they ask under cross-examination? And that is a question that I have for you, Rachel. What do you expect them to say how they're going to cross-examine the medical examiner? Because what I've seen so far is they've questioned the eyewitness accounts of certain witnesses. Now, as you said, there's pretty strong evidence here against Mr. Grate. So why go after a witness and say, well, you saw my client, you saw the defendant from his profile, you knew it was him? I mean, are these the questions that you really should be asking? Are they just trying to ask something, look like they're doing anything to?
Well, I guess
is that doubt? I mean, what is their goal here about creating reasonable doubt if they're trying to do that?
Well, again, I guess the attorneys have to do something here, right? But I don't. Again, I've said this over and over again. I don't think there's going to be reasonable doubt for this phase of the trial. However, going down the line, and if they do go down this insanity defense, some of these questions might be important. Specifically, if during cross-examination the defense asks about this tendency that Shawn Grate mentioned in the interview about how he couldn't help himself but kill, right? That could be something the defense might try to ask further questions of during the cross-examination. So it's not all for naught. I think some of it is maybe a bit of a show to act like they are putting on some kind of defense for this guy, but you know, he has a right to defend himself, and we'll just see where the evidence takes us in this one.
I'm sure they have a strategy, and we'll have to see what the ultimate strategy is moving on in the Shawn Grate case. Again, we have a live feed. They're listening to the audio taped interview that he had. The audio is a little bad. You can't really hear it. If it clears up, we'll make sure to go back into the courtroom. What I want to do right now is play a clip. This is Captain David Lay, who testified last week about his interview with Jane Doe, the woman that called 911, the woman that unraveled this whole case, the woman who alleges that Shawn Grate kidnapped and sexually assaulted her multiple times. Let's play some of that testimony from last week. That's some of the heart-wrenching and compelling testimony from Jane Doe, the woman who alleges that Shawn Grate kidnapped and sexually assaulted her multiple times in many different ways. Now, joining me again via Skype is Joseph Scott Morgan, and also here on set is Rachel Stockman. I know my time with both of my guests is coming to an end, so I just would like some final thoughts. First from Joseph, as we watch this case, as you heard the testimony from Jane Doe from last week, what do you think and what can we expect?
Very compelling, Jesse, just heart-wrenching. This is what I think needs to happen at this point. I think that prosecution is going to have to, these deceased victims, they're going to have to humanize them, and they're going to have to take the science that's going to be put forward and humanize them through that, to talk about their suffering. They no longer have a voice in this, and they need to paint the picture very thoroughly. Defense is going to have an uphill battle, I think, based upon all of this physical evidence and also this evidence that's come to light relative to this diary, coupled along with his statements that he made to the police. So it's going to be quite compelling to watch. I'm interested to see what the coroner has to say down the tracks.
Yeah, and you said giving a voice to the victims. Rachel, what do you think?
I mean, it was just so difficult to hear something like this. Here is this woman, talking about how she was repeatedly raped over and over again in all kinds of ways, and just kind of some of the really kind of sadistic things that he did to her. But one thing that I found really interesting from her testimony was kind of the MO he used, in that he really befriended her, got her to trust him. She was very religious, and they kind of bonded in that area. And then all of a sudden, according to her testimony, he really just snapped and turned into this evil person. It will be interesting to see if that is what kind of follows with some of the other victims. I do agree with your other guest, Joseph Scott Morgan, here, that I think this is a very, very uphill battle for the defense. I think it's going to be a very difficult task for them, and I'm sure they're just waiting for really the death penalty phase of this to put forward any of their mitigating factors in terms of his mental capacity.
Yeah, I know. And as you said, Jane Doe thought that this was a goofy older brother type and could be farther from the truth. All right, Rachel. All right, Joseph, thank you so much for joining me. It was great to have you both on.
Thanks for having me, Jesse.
Great. All right, everybody, so we are going to go back live into the courtroom right now. You will be about to listen to the audio tapes of the defendant himself talking about what he did on those tragic, tragic days. Let's listen in.